Continue where we left off, okay? So before the crossing of the mountains, where was I? So the Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The stores were broader, heavier build. So the stores were bigger hobbits, obviously. Their feet and hands were larger, so they had larger feet, and they preferred flatlands and riversides. The fallen hides were fairer of skin and also of hair, so they're more beautiful hobbits, I guess, right? Were fairer of skin and also hair, and they were taller and slimmer, so they were taller and skinnier than the others. They were lovers of trees and of the woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westwards early and roamed over Eriador as far as the Weathertop, while the others were still in Woodland. Right? So the Harfoots were the hobbits who had dealings with the dwarves, obviously, in the ancient times, whereas the other ones, the other ones were what? Were in Wilderland, whatever it is. They were the most normal and representative variety of the hobbits. So the what? The Harfoots were the most normal, and they represented the huge chunk of the Hobbit way of life, or whatever it is, or the population of the hobbits. I don't know what he really means there, because the book is, J.R.R. Tolkien has so much stuff going on. It's crazy. They were the most normal representative variety of hobbits, and far the most numerous. So the majority, the good chunk of the population of the hobbits were the Harfoots, obviously, whereas the lesser population were the stores and the fallen hides. So they were the most inclined to settle in one place and longest preserve their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. In a hole to live a hobbit, obviously. How hobbits live in holes, obviously. When you watch the Shire, you see how they live in a hole, obviously. Right? The stores lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots and followed the course of the Loudwater southwards. So the stores had greater dealings with the men than the other two races of hobbits, obviously, right? That's what he's saying here. The borders of Dunland before they moved north again were again another land. So much fucking lands, man. The fallen hides the least numerous. So the fallen hides were the most extinct of the hobbits, obviously. So the fallen hides are the what? Are the tall, slim, and what? The tall, slim hobbits, obviously. They were the most friendly with elves. Obviously. So the stores had dealings with men, and the fallen hides had dealings with the elves, obviously, and they were the least numerous of the hobbits, obviously. Where the northerly branch, they were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language. So they were able to interpret, understand the elven tongue and that kind of stuff, right? And song than the handicrafts. And of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountain north of Rivendell and came down the river of Harwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds that preceded them. Being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders of chieftains among clans of Harfoots and stores. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallendish strain could still be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. So the Fallen Hides had the greater families, obviously. The greater families, like it says here in the book, right? In the Westlands of Eriador, man, this is a drag to read, man. Hence why, if you want to read Lord of the Rings, you have to get used to the information, because the information is crazy. And there's so much stuff going on in the book, man. It's crazy, man. In the Westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain. The Dunedain are the men who are descended from the Numenors. I did some research. And they're the men who are blessed with long life. Aragorn is a Dunedain. He's blessed with long life. In the book, he's like 80 years old, whatever it is. He's 80-something years old. He looks young, but he's age, obviously. He's like 80 years old, and he's blessed with long life, obviously. Dude, he's one of the Dunedain, right? The kings of men that came over the sea out of Westerness, but they were dwindling fast, and the land of their North Kingdom were falling far and wide into waste. There was room into spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in order communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and had and been forgotten in Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important still endured. Though reduced in size, this was at Bree and Chetwood that lay around about some 40 miles east of the Shire. So Bree is 40 miles east from the Shire, where the hobbits live, obviously. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain. So they learned how to write like they learned how to write in the manner of the Dunedain, the men who were blessed with long life, who are descendants from the Númenórs, whatever it is. Right? I hope this is not boring, because if it's boring, I don't know, I might just make this video and I might not even read, because I'm afraid this series might be boring. It's just me reading Lord of the Rings. It might be a bit boring, I'm saying. Right, I might just make this prologue video and I might just end it there, man. Because I don't know if I can read. This is, like, Lord of the Rings is a pretty boring book to read, man. Like, even though it's amazing, it's a drag to read, man. It really is, man. I'm saying. Though reduced in size, this was at Bree and in Chetwood, and lay around about some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from the elves. So the Dunedain learned how to write letters from the elves. From the elves. They learned from the elves. Hence why and that makes sense. It now makes sense. Hence why what? Sorry. The Dunedain learned the art of writing letters, I believe, from the elves, or speech. I don't know what it means here exactly. And in those days, also, they forgot whatever language they had used before and spoke ever after the common speech. The Westron, as it was named, that was current through all the lands of the kings from Arnar. Again, another land. So much fucking lands in this book. It's crazy, man. To Gondor, and about all the coasts of the Sea of Belfalas, another land. To Lune, another land. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names of the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history, with a reckoning for years. For it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age. Again, the Third Age, the end of the Third Age is Lord of the Rings, whereas the First and Second Age predates Lord of the Rings, obviously. Fallenhide brothers, Marcho and Blanco. So Marcho and Blanco were Fallenhide brothers. The Fallenhides were what? They're the what? They're the tall and skinny elves, tall and skinny hobbits who were associated with the elves, obviously, right? Like I mentioned earlier, obviously. Marcho, am I right there? Yeah. Yeah, Fallenhide brothers Marcho and Blanco set out to Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornos, they crossed the Brown River of Barad-dûr, again another river. This is crazy, man. With a great fallen hobbits, they passed over the bridge of Stone Bowls, another land. Lord Jared Tolkien has so much land, it's fucking crazy. It's impossible for you. I challenge anyone right now. It is impossible as a first-time reader to grasp 90% of Lord of the Rings. It's too much information. You have to do some research. You have to read the book at least multiple times to fully grasp the book, because Jared Tolkien drags on with his description. It's crazy, man. His world-building is so deep and in depth, right? They crossed the Brown River of Barad-dûr with a great following of the hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone brows that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom. They took all the land beyond the dwelling, between the river and the far downs. So the Fallenhides pretty much took over what? They took over some of the lands beyond what? Beyond the bridge of the stone brows, whatever it is. And they dwelt there, whatever it is. They dwelt in those lands between the river and the far downs. And all that was what? All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads speed the king's messengers that acknowledge his lordship. So in exchange for the race of hobbits, right? The tall and skinny race of hobbits. I forget the name of the hobbits. What's the name of the hobbits again? Yeah, for the Fallenhide hobbits to dwell in those lands and those parts, obviously. It says here that they should keep the great bridge in repair, obviously, and all other bridges and roads, so they should, right, and speed the king's messengers and acknowledge his lordship. They should pay respect to the male king, obviously, to the king, obviously. Thus began the Shire reckoning for the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the names. The hobbits named what? The hobbits called it Brandywine, obviously. The Brandywine Bridge, right? Remember in Lord of the Rings movie, you had the Brandywine Bridge? Well, that bridge that they ended up what? The bridge that they ended up what? Give me a second. Yeah, they ended up naming the bridge Brandywine Bridge. In the movie, you have something called Brandywine Bridge. The hobbits ended up naming that bridge Brandywine Bridge, obviously. So you have some history there, obviously, right? As the hobbits turned the name, become year one of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. Yeah. I don't know if the hobbits named it. It says the crossing of the Brandywine as the hobbits turned the name. Became year one of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the western hobbits fell in love with their new land. So they fell in love with the Shire, obviously, the first year of the Shire, obviously, and soon passed one more out of history of men and elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects. So the king ruled over the hobbits, obviously. So while there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, obviously. But they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. Remember how I said earlier how the hobbits in the Shire is pretty much their own country, and everything in the outside world is like cut off to them. You know what I'm saying? They're cut off. They're pretty much cut off from the outside world. It says here, I'll read it again. While there was still a king, they were in his name subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains. Remember when I talked about the races of what? The tall, skinny, the skinny hobbits, who some of them were chieftains. Remember when I mentioned that a couple pages ago? Right? Well, there was still a king. They were in name his subjects, but they were in fact what? They were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not all with the Witch Lord of Angmar, obviously. And meddled not all with events in the world outside, because the hobbits, the Shire is like home to the hobbits, pretty much. And they're pretty much cut off from the outside world, pretty much. To the last battle at Fornos with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they what? The witch king of Angmar is what? Is that what? The king of the ring race, whoever it is. You watch the movie. Gandalf talks about the witch king of Angmar, right? They sent home bowmen to aid of the king. Well, so they maintained, though no tales of men recorded. But in that war, the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land of their own, and they chose from their own chiefs the Thane to hold authority of the king that was gone. So when the king died, the hobbits what? The hobbits chose a king, obviously. So, but in that war, when the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, obviously, they chose from their own chiefs a Thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. So the hobbits had a king, and the king left. Obviously, they had to choose a king, choose someone to hold authority over them. There, for over 1,000 years, they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the Dark Plague. Again, I don't know what the Dark Plague is. I never read the history and all that stuff. Until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. So there was a famine and long winter that the hobbits experienced, obviously. Many thousands then perished, but the days of Dearth, I don't know who Dearth is, were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted, when they entered it, it had before been well tilted, and there the king had once many farms, corn lands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. Nobody cares. The hobbits named it the Shire, as a region of the authority of their Thane, obviously. So they named the land the Shire, obviously. That's how the Shire got its name. And a district of well-ordered business. And there, that pleasant corner of the world, they piled their well-ordered business of living. And they heeded less and less the world outside, where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule of Middle Earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians, and the labourers of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were in fact sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike. So hobbits are not really fighters, right? As clearly you see it in the movie, like Merry and them fight, but hobbits are not really known as fighters and warriors. They're more known as people who just live at peace in the Shire. Yeah. At no time had the hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days, they had, of course, been obliged to fight to maintain themselves in the hard world. So they had to fight, obviously, to what? They had to fight to maintain themselves, obviously, in a harsh world of Middle Earth, obviously. But in Bilbo's time, that was very ancient history. The last battle before his story opens, and indeed the only one that has ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The battles of the Greenfields. So the Battle of the Greenfields is the only battle that has been fought within the borders of the Shire, obviously, in which Banburas Took, I don't know who that is, rooted an invasion of orcs. Even the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter wine winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So though there were still some stores of weapons in the Shire, these were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or on walls, or gathered into the museum at Michelle Delving. The Mather House was called, whatever that place is called, for anything that hobbits had to immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away. They called the Matham. Again, you gotta memorize all this stuff. It's crazy. The dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of some sort. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left this people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were perhaps so unwarily fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, at need could still handle arms. They shot well with a bow, so they're good with bow and arrows, obviously. They're good with shooting bow and arrows, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark. It's funny, because in the movies you don't see any hobbits shooting arrows. Not only with bows and arrows, if any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quicker under cover, as all trespassing region knew very well. And that's where Peter Jackson got the idea of Merry and Pippin throwing those stones in Fellowship of the Ring. Because it says here, if any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quick under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. So everyone knows hobbits are what? They're accurate at throwing stones. And hence why in the movie, Pippin and Merry are badasses when they throw all these stones. If you watch the special edition, you'll see how Pippin and Merry, when Boromir blows that horn, he protects the hobbits in the end of Fellowship of the Ring. You notice how Pippin and Merry throw all these stones, because the hobbits are amazing stone throwers, pretty much. Right? So if any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quick under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home. So they live in a hole, obviously, in the Shire, obviously. But in the course of time, they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days, it was as a rule only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most superior kind, more holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of simple diggings of old. So the rich live in the more fancier homes, obviously, whereas the poor live in more in worse homes, obviously, in the Shire, obviously, with like one window. Though the poor people live in a home with like one window, whereas the rich have a more luxurious home to live in, a more hole to live in, right? But suitable sites for these large ramifying tunnels, or smiles as they call them, were not everywhere to be found, and the flats in the low-lying districts, the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Obviously, so as the population of the hobbit grew, they started to build homes above ground and that kind of stuff. Indeed, even in the hilly regions of the older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tarkaboro. Again, Tarkaboro is not mentioned in the movie. I told you there's a lot of differences in the book and the movie. Obviously, Hobbiton is mentioned. Hobbiton's mentioned in the what? In the movie, but Tarkaboro is not mentioned in what? In the movie, man. One of the chief townships of the Shire, Michael delving on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were especially favored by millers, smiths, roppers, and cartwrights, what cartwright is, whatever it is, and others of that sort. For even they, when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. So they're very industriative, obviously. Right? The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of Marish, down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter of the East Farthing were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather. So whenever it was muddy outside, they actually wore boots, obviously. But they were well known to be stores in a large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that they mainly grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallonhide had any trace of beard. The Harfoots and Fallonhide, they didn't have beards, obviously. Indeed, the folk of the Marish and of the Buckland east of the river, which afterwards occupied, came for the most part later into the Shire, or from Southway, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words that found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building and many other crafts besides was derived from the Dunedain, again, the men blessed with long life. But the hobbits may have learned it directly from the elves, the teachers of men, in their youth. So the hobbits learned the craft of building from what? From the teachers of men, and even the elves, obviously, from their youth, obviously. For the elves of the high kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at the time at the Grey Havens away to the west. So the elves dwelt in the Grey Havens in the west, obviously, and other places within. Remember in the movie when Frodo and Sam are like, where are those elves going? It's like they're heading to the Grey Havens. Remember the Grey Havens? Remember that? Well, that's where they get the idea from in this book, obviously. And other places within the reach of the Shire, 3 elf towers of Emerald age were still to be seen on the Tower Hills beyond the western marshes. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green field. The hobbits of the West Farthing said that one could see the sea from top of that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and few still have ever returned to report it. Obviously. So few hobbits have sailed upon the sea, obviously, and few still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. Hence why, remember that scene in the Fellowship Ring when Sam's like, "Of course you are, but I'm coming with you. You don't leave when Samwise Gamgee." Remember that part, right? Remember here it says the hobbits can't swim. Well, Peter Jackson did an amazing job by showing the world that hobbits cannot swim. When Sam drowns in the water and Frodo pulls out his hand, he pulls him out of the water. Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna do a series on this because this might be a bit boring. You know what I'm saying? Me reading for like an hour and a half, that's pretty boring. Yeah. Because the prologue of Lord of the Rings is a pretty boring book, man. It's a pretty boring section. You have to really, if you really want to read this section, you really gotta You gotta pull through it, man. Because it's really, really boring, the prologue in Lord of the Rings. Right. And as the days of the Shire lengthened and they spoke less and less with elves, and grew afraid of them. So the hobbits grew afraid of the elves, obviously, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them, obviously. And the sea became a word of fear among them, and a token of death. And they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it to their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more than built limitations of smeals, wherever that is. That's with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turfs, and having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and the hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors. Again, you got an idea of that in Fellowship of the Ring when Bilbo had that circled door, right? And you saw the grass on top of the house, that kind of stuff. He's giving us some descriptions here, obviously, right? That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of the hobbit architecture. Again, you got an idea of that in the movies, obviously. The houses of the holes of Shire hobbits were often large, inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as their friendship with the elves. Obviously. Sometimes, as in the case of Tooks of Great Smiles or the Brandybucks of Brandy, so you have the families of hobbits. You have the Tooks, you have the Brandybucks, obviously, of Brandy Hall. Many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. So some of the families were rich, obviously, right? All the hobbits were, in any case, clannish and reckoned up their relationship with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. So they again, Samwise Gamgee is a gardener. He's an example of a hobbit, planting vegetation, that kind of stuff. Clannish and reckoned up with their relationship with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is impossible to remember who is related to whom, and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that include even the more important members of the more important families at the time in which these tales tell of. The genealogy trees at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are small books themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delight in such things if they were accurate. They like to have books filled with things that they already knew. Set out fair and square with no contradictions. I have 10 pages left. I don't know if you guys want me to read for another 10 pages, man. You want me to read for another 10 pages? I could if I want to, but I mean. That's why Lord of the Rings, if you read the book, you really, really have to pay attention. The prologue, you don't really have to pay attention to the prologue. The prologue doesn't really, you don't have to read the prologue to understand the story of Fellowship of the Ring. But the prologue of Fellowship of the Ring is quite a drag to read, man. And it's pretty boring. I'm just saying. So. Right? There's another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned. An astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clear wood the smoke of the burning leaves of the herb, which they called pipeweed or leaf. Remember in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, they mentioned pipeweed? It shows a hobbit smoking pipeweed. Well, they got the idea from here, obviously. They called pipeweed. And for example, in Zanus, Job smokes a lot of weed. He has his pipe, and he smokes a lot of weed. You know what I'm saying? I got that idea from Lord of the Rings, obviously. I took a few ideas from Lord of the Rings. Like Job was a pothead and he smokes weed in Last of Zanus. Right. They call pipeweed of leaf a very part of Nicotiana. That's what they call it. So the weed they smoke was Nicotiana, whatever it is. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this peculiar custom or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybuck. He's one of the hobbit families, obviously. Later master of Buckland, and since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play a part in the history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to the herb lore of the Shire, whatever that is, may be quoted. This, he says, is the one art that can be certainly claimed to be our own invention. When hobbits first begin to smoke is not known. So J.R.R. Tolkien doesn't explain when the first group of hobbits started smoking, obviously. When the hobbits first began to smoke, it is not known. All the legends of family histories take it for granted. For ages, folk in the Shire smoked various herbs. So for years, the hobbits have been smoking a lot of different kind of weed and that kind of stuff, right? And tobacco. Some fouler, some sweeter. So you had sour weed and you had sweeter weed, right? All accounts agree that Tobold, Horvillnor, or Longbarm in the Self-Faring first grew the true pipe weed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim II, about the year of 1070 of the Shire reckoning, right? The best homegrown still comes from the district, especially the varieties now known as Long Bottom Leaf, Old Toby, and the Southern Star. I'm going to shut my camera off here.